Howdy, friends. This is Matthew Sewell, and you're listening to episode 112 of the Popecast, a history of the papacy, the only podcast about popes where you'll find non-boring stories on the successors of St. Peter, and reminder that all the world's problems have happened plenty of times before. Well, the very special guest indeed on this week's show, I'm joined by Elise Ann Allen. She's a senior correspondent for Crux in Rome, and she recently conducted the first exclusive, extensive papal interviews of Pope Leo XIV's pontificate. Huge opportunity for her. Really interesting interview, and I think you're going to love it. Those conversations have been turned into a brand new book from Penguin Random House entitled Leo XIV, Citizen of the World, Missionary of the 21st Century. In the episode, we talk quite a bit about what it's like to sit across from the first American Pope, the man behind the name, and her impressions on what might be in store in the coming months and years from our new pontiff. I really enjoyed this conversation on a personal level, so I'm confident you will as well. One quick thing before we jump in. If you're watching on YouTube, please be sure to subscribe to the Popecast channel and also the notification bell to be notified when we drop new content. And also, we'd love if you left a comment after listening to let us know what you liked most about this particular episode. Also, be sure to subscribe over at popes.substack.com so you never miss an episode, and so you also always get our regular newsletter, Today in Papal History. That's also the best way to monetarily support the work we do here at the Popecast if you feel so called. So again, that site is popes.substack.com. A caveat quickly, I guess. You can, of course, subscribe for free and get all the content, but you can also support the show and the newsletter for as little as $6 a month or $60 a year, or if you feel so bold, you can even join the more elite rank of Pontifical Superfans, our founders tier, which also gets you some additional swag like this custom Popecast mug, some sweet stickers, a handwritten note from me. There might also be a shirt involved, but that's not available to anybody else. So whatever the level, regardless, my family and I are incredibly grateful for your support, and I am so happy to be your guide once again on this journey through the winding roads of papal history. I hope you enjoy the show. Well, welcome back to the Popecast. Joining me this week is Elise Ann Allen from Crux. Thanks, Elise, for joining the show. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Matthew. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's not every day I get to chat with somebody who's chatted with the Pope directly, especially since Pope Leo's still pretty new. But yeah, really excited to hear all about that. I mean, the first question that I really wanted to ask you, but I imagine it'll entice listeners too, is what was it like, just again, on a human level, interviewing the Pope, sitting across a small circular table from him for, what was it, 2 sessions of 2.5 hours each, did I read?
2 sessions for an hour and a half each. So it was a total of 3 hours of conversation, which is, I think, still surreal. Like, this is like June. So I don't know how many months it is later now. Like, no, it's July. We had our first conversation. July. Yeah. So it's like 4 months later now or something. So it's, yeah, it's still fresh. I think I've talked about this ad nauseum since then.
Of
Um,
course, yeah, understandably.
Yeah, but people are curious. They wanna know about him. They wanna know who he is because I think that's part of, I've just noticed. I mean, maybe this is the first conclave I covered, so maybe this is the case with every new pope, but, some of them I think are probably more well known. I think Benedict certainly was very well known when he was elected. I think Francis even had a bigger profile than Leo did. Robert Prevost prior to his election was somebody most people didn't know.
Right.
And they still don't really know. They know him now as Leo, and they're finding things out about his life as they look up, who he is and what he's done. And they know now more about his time in Peru, but he's still a big unknown to a lot of people. So I think there is this mystique about the man still and what he's about. So for me, it was a real privilege to be able to sit down with him and to talk about exactly that. Who are you and what are you about?
Mhm.
Because this was an interview for a biography that I had been asked to do previously, and I'd actually started the first chapter when I was thinking, gosh, like it really makes sense to have an interview with the subject if I'm going to tell this story and tell it right.
Mhm.
And I had known Robert Prevost prior to his
Okay.
election, as Pope. They're not very. I met him for the first time actually in Peru in 2018. I was down there for a reporting trip, and had asked for a series of meetings. And he was one of the ones that I was actually given. I hadn't asked to meet with him, but I was looking into a group down there that was it had all kinds of scandals involved, in Peru, in this group, and it was eventually suppressed by Pope Francis. But at the time, Robert Prevost was head of the National Safeguarding Commission, and he was like spearheading the bishop's own investigation into this outfit. So they said, "You should talk to him too." So I said, "Okay." And on that day, actually, the other meeting that I had, fell through. That person didn't show up. They were busy and couldn't make it. So I only met with Robert Prevost and had a great conversation. Very open, very frank, very transparent, which I thought was abnormal at the time for a bishop.
Mhm. Right.
So that kind of stuck with me. And then, he came to Rome in 2023. We sort of reconnected, and, I asked for appointments every now and then in his office to discuss work matters. And he was always very gracious in giving them to me, and receiving me. I think he had, with people that he had a rapport with, he was very easygoing like that.
Mhm.
And, so when I reached out for the interview, I think, for him, there was, in saying yes, there was a certain like, okay, trust level because okay, I know you and I know how you work. I've seen that on
Mhm.
occasion. I think I trust you to tell my story right. But he liked that it was for a biography too. I think it wasn't like a hard hitting news
Oh,
interview where they could try
yeah.
to pin him into a corner or something, or get a big, snazzy headline out of it. It really was an introduction to the world, and I think he liked having that opportunity and the whole candor of the conversation. First of all, you walk into I guess there's several stages, that you go through when you're preparing for something like this. So from the moment he said yes, it was like, okay, now what do I do? I got to prepare.
Right.
So,
Right.
like, okay. So I had actually just planned a reporting trip to Peru. Well, not a reporting trip, but I planned a trip to Peru to do some interviews for the book and to do some research. So we'd set our first conversation, we said, well, let's set the first conversation for after that. And I'm really glad I did because I learned so much about him when I was there. And I talked to so many people who had known him and worked with him and been close to him and people who still are. So for me, it was a really valuable experience to be there. And that helped shape the kind of questions I asked, in the first conversation. The first conversation was all biographical. It was about his life, his ministry, his impressions of Peru, his interaction with things, like conversations that were happening even theologically at the time. Liberation theology was big, and
Mhm.
implementing the Second Vatican Council. Um, but also culturally, what was going on in Peru and his reaction to that. But then also to how did he handle other stages of his life, and how did he even perceive his own election, so
Mhm.
we had a very beautiful conversation, and the second one was more current affairs. So it's like that's in the last chapter of the book is basically that Q&A. With it's a look to the future. So I always tell
Mhm.
people, I know you're going to skip to the end of the book and read the Q&A, but please read the whole thing because you can't like read the whole thing and then read the Q&A or just, reread it after having read, the whole book because you really can't understand who Leo is and what he's about and what he's going to do without reading and knowing his roots and the context that formed him first,
Mhm.
and then you can understand much better what he says in the final Q&A. Um, so all of that being said, I once I got back from Peru, it was a matter of preparing the questions, and it was like, okay, I can't make this forever. I did tell him it was a book, and so it was, we might need more than one session, but I didn't want to take too much of his time.
Mhm.
So it was like, let's limit it to like 3 to 4 questions max, per chapter, and I already had the chapters lined out, and there are 7 chapters in the book. So I basically, tried to identify the elements of his life that I thought were most important, and that's, and target and hone in on those things. Um, and so the biggest question, that you ask going into that day, is like, "Okay, this is it," Um, having known him previously, it was like, this is our first conversation and it's very private. It was just he and I. And I don't think people realize that there was no team there. It wasn't videoed, so it was just one on one. and that was a
Mhm.
really special dynamic, like, nobody who gets that opportunity, you know?
Right. Mhm.
Um, so your big question is he gonna be the same? Is he the same guy? Has something changed? Has How has he reacted to the office, you know? And from the moment he walked in, like, I was brought up to this little waiting room, and then he came in and greeted me and then, took me to the little room where we had our conversation. Um, and from the minute he walked in, it was just, I think he put us both at ease, you know? He was just, it was obvious he was very much himself. He was very much the same man, like unchanged at all. This warm smile, he stretched out his hand to shake mine, asked how my husband was doing, um, and was just very welcoming and very hospitable,
Right.
so then he led me into the room and, we got started in our conversation. And I think, he never gives interviews. He never did even previously, in all of his time as bishop also, and as cardinal, he never really gave interviews.
Mhm.
So this was sort of new for him, you know? So the first question,
Right.
he's sitting up straight and it's like, you could tell he's like maybe a little anxious or a little nervous.
What was because he'd been Pope for what, 2 months at that point? I remember a couple of the answers that
Yeah.
were in kind
two
of the
months
teaser article.
two
Yeah, maybe
months
that was, I guess, the second conversation. But 2 months. How easy would it be for somebody like him to forget? Oh yeah, I'm the Pope now.
Yeah,
Whereas
I think
before he
it's
was a cardinal, but he was kind of a behind the scenes guy who didn't, like you said, give a lot of interviews and things like that. But yeah, I can
yeah,
imagine that'd be a funny place to be mentally, to have to
yeah, it was
remember
all
that you're
still very fresh, and you could tell he was still, like, surreal for him, like, even when we
right.
were talking about his election, he was still like, "I still can't believe this," you know? Um, but it was, I have to say, how was it? It was a very natural. It was very natural. It was a very comfortable conversation, after, like, the first 2 questions, he eased up and I eased up, and, like, we just started having a conversation, and it was more than an interview, it became a conversation between the 2 of us. Um, and it was like increasingly, that he was just sharing himself and his life. It became, from an interview to a conversation to a moment of sharing, and that's different a little bit even than a conversation, like he was really sharing from himself. And he would think he's a very reflective person, and I think we could see that as Pope. He doesn't say anything without thinking and reflecting
Right.
on it. Every word is very carefully like reflected on and um so it was something that was very natural. It was a very, I'd say it was the perfect dynamic if you're going to interview somebody, and as the interviewer, like I was of course nervous, like I knew him a little bit, beforehand, which helped put me at ease too, and very soon, yeah, I was just like I was talking, you know, um to a friend, I was talking to my Robert Prevost that I knew before. And
Mhm.
so it was a wonderful conversation. And I have to say, having that time and that space, just the 2 of us, was a real privilege, and the second conversation, my husband, John Allen, those who follow, John, he was
Mhm.
there in the background and would interject sometimes.
Right. Yeah.
So it was like, and that gave it a nice quality too. It was sort of like a family thing, because he
Mhm.
knows my husband too, and so it was, so in both conversations, he's very open, very at ease with himself. He tried to give very honest and transparent answers, even if he is not saying everything that he can, of course.
Mhm.
I think he would give us hints of things, um, you know, uh, like ideas, little nuggets of things maybe he plans to do. I think the sense I got is he already has some clear visions, for things that he wants to do as Pope, and courses of action he wants to take. Um, but he needs to set those pieces in motion. So he's trying to give us a little sneak peek, I think. So I got the sense he's being very genuine. There was not a question he did not want to answer.
Mhm.
And that was very special. So I think at a human level, I think it was as like a good a conversation as you could have wanted, even just at a human level, and especially
Mhm.
with somebody um, of of his stature, that is now occupying arguably one of the most important roles in the world.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Well, I the way that you talk about him reminds me of, I live in Spokane, Washington, and Bishop Thomas Daly is our bishop here. And I remember I talked to, interestingly enough, Father Gary Thomas, who the rite was based off of, the exorcist from San Jose. And he's the most mild mannered, meek, quiet guy that you'd expect. I mean, that's beside the point. But I remember asking him once, because he has known Bishop Daley since he was a seminarian. I said, like, what's been the thing that has surprised you the most? He said, no matter what stage he's been at, seminary rector, principal of a Catholic school or whatever, bishop, he's always just been Tom first. He's just been a guy who happens to be in all these roles. And the way that you talk about Pope Leo, and from what I've read in other places from other people too, is that he just happens to be a guy who happens to be the Pope, which in my experience in studying papal history, those are the best ones. Pope Leo is still brand new. He probably doesn't want me to be saying he's doing a good job yet or something like that. But the best ones, the ones who don't want the job and who tend to do the best at it, happen to just find themselves as the Bishop of Rome and then
Yeah.
follow whatever the Holy Spirit's, leading them to do.
Well, I can tell you, like, he certainly never expected it, you know? He says that in our conversation in the interview, like, he really didn't expect it. Mostly he didn't expect them to elect an American. He thought that would never happen, you know? And that was sort of always been the perception, you know? Like, you have a global superpower and you're gonna give him a pope too, you know? Like, that's an awful
Right.
lot for
Yeah.
one for one place to have. But he really wasn't seen as American, you know? He spent so much of his life and of his ministry abroad, you know? It was all in Peru and then, a bit in Rome as well, and so he was really seen as, just the title of my book, as a citizen of the world, really, he's
Hmm.
somebody that is not just the United States, but he's Latin America, he's Europe. He's somebody that knows Africa and Asia as well because of, his travels there and his experience as superior general of the Augustinians. So he's somebody
Hmm.
that, really has an interesting profile, and he's occupied every sort of position that you could have or you could want, right? In a pope, he's a pastor, he was a formator, he's a judge in an ecclesiastical tribunal,
Hmm.
parish priest, missionary, then superior general and bishop, cardinal, So he's done it all, right? So I think he was a very interesting and intriguing choice for a lot of people, but he never expected it.
Hmm.
And he and I actually I joked with this, I joked with him about this in our first conversation that, like, I'd seen him in late February or early March when Pope Francis was still in the hospital.
Oh,
And
really? Okay.
yeah, so I'd asked for an appointment with at his office to, like, discuss off the record something I was working on. He said, "Sure, like, come by," and very gracious as always, but, um at the end of the conversation, I said, by the way, Francis, is still in the hospital. Looks like things aren't going so well. If he doesn't make it out of this, people are already talking about the papabile, your
Hmm.
name's getting thrown out, as a top candidate. I said, are you getting nervous? And he said, oh, no, 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 no. Like, they would never elect an American. So I'm sleeping easy.
Right. Oh my gosh. That's what I still laugh about that. But I remember, like, my own disbelief. I'm pretty sure it was every American's disbelief. It's like, there's no way an American's going to get elected Pope. So no. But then you'd read these things like, if you set aside the American part, he was a shoe-in. So it's
He
no
was
wonder that he ended up
the
getting elected.
perfect
But that's
candidate.
so funny that even he was like, I'm not getting elected. I'm from America.
He thought that, like, at the end of the day, like, they just wouldn't do it. Like, something would happen, they just wouldn't do it. And then I think during the conclave, he realized, like, he started to sweat a little bit more. He's like, "Okay, I think
Right.
this might actually happen," and
Right.
obviously it did, so, so I joked with him about that in, like, the first conversation, just like, "Haha, yeah." Like, "You tried to warn me," you know?
Right.
Um
Oh, that's so funny. Well, yeah, I'm sure all of his answers were profound in their own right, but what were some that you're able to share without spoiling, the book or whatever, um, that really have stuck with you ever since? I mean, it's been what, 5 months now since your first conversation. You said it's been just a couple months since your second one, but yeah, what are some that have still stuck out with you or stuck with you based on how he answered or what he said in some of those?
I think there are several things that stick out, and it depends on what you want to know mostly. Like, if you're interested in the current affairs stuff or you're interested in the biographical stuff, because I think there are things that stick out to me on either side. Current affairs stuff I can tick off. I think his approach to politics, right, and his approach to how he's going to handle the church, I think, is one of the biggest questions I've continued to have, and especially with the Trump administration, and I think the biggest thing that stuck out to me is that, he's a pastor, not a politician, and his
Yeah.
answers, have, confirmed that, and he said, look, I am the Pope, I'm the head of state, but I'm also the head of the Catholic Church. My job is not to solve the world's problems,
Hmm.
it's to encourage Christians in their faith. My job is not to tell world leaders what they shouldn't or shouldn't be doing in their countries, it's to encourage Christians to live the gospel.
Hmm.
That's what I'm here to do, is to encourage the faith, really, and to try to encourage, processes that support humanity and human dignity globally.
Hmm.
And so, he said he has something, if there's an issue on the, with one government, he's, like, it doesn't matter. It could be the United States with Donald Trump, or it could be somebody else. My job is to work with my pastors, and they can engage their local governments. It's not my job to necessarily get involved in the politics of a given country.
Hmm.
So I thought that was very interesting, and it says a lot about what his strategy is going to be, especially at such um, a complicated time, I think, arguably,
Hmm.
globally. The world is on edge. There's a lot of changing, geopolitical scene that's happening, and a lot of people are uneasy that, you're talking about global conflicts, and he again said, he doesn't see his role to be overly involved in the political side of things, or to be a mediator necessarily. Francis, for example, really wanted the Vatican, was hoping that the Holy See could have, a role in mediating, for example, the war in Ukraine. Leo doesn't see that so much as realistic, number one. And number two, I don't think he sees that as a priority. I think he's here to help. And if the Holy See is a neutral party, can be a place where they can facilitate discussions. We want to encourage the peace process because that is
Hmm.
good for lives,
Hmm.
on the ground. So, I think that whole approach to his job is something that stuck out as very unique. So I thought that was perhaps the most striking in terms of his mentality and how he plans to do things, but he did seem, to have very clear priorities, in terms of reforms he wanted to do, at home and in-house. Again, he didn't reveal too much of his hand, but talking about the reform of the Curia, he wants dicasteries to be more collaborative and to interact more because they're sort of individual silos at this point, and he
Hmm.
wants that to change. So I think we can expect some changes there. I think the big things you were talking about, the role of women, or like the LGBT issue, he's going to maintain, I think, broadly what Francis did. He said clearly, I'm not going to change doctrine or
Hmm.
church teaching on either of these things. But we could be more welcoming, and we have to be more welcoming, and we can be more inclusive of women in leadership, and we can appreciate them more. I think what he said, which stuck out to me, was, we need to change our attitude more than change our structures when it comes to these issues. And I think that's something that Francis was also trying very much to do, but wasn't so well understood,
Right. Mhm.
so so Leo, I think, is going to encourage, the church to keep walking in that direction. How can we make sure that everybody feels welcome, and how can we make sure that women still have a place and are valued in leadership, but without changing the essentials? We need to change how we look at these categories, if you will. Um, and I think there's a lot I could say biographically that stuck out about the man. I think the biggest thing I can say is I think he's very committed, and he's a man of action, if you look at from the moment he arrived in Peru, he arrived in 1985 for the very first time.
Okay.
He was there for a year and a half, and then he went back to the States, or I think to Rome, for a year and a half to finish his his canon law degree. And then he was sent back to Peru and was there for 11 years, in Trujillo. And, you know, when he arrived, it was like, and all throughout his ministry, really, it was like Peru's in perpetual crisis, and then 1985, you have terrorism, the Sendero Luminoso, and you have another terrorist group that was active. You have a political crisis, you have a financial crisis, and that carried through into the 1990s, and you had dispute over, the regime of, the leadership of Alberto Fujimori, and, the allegations of human rights abuses, and their demonstrations on the street, and he accompanied the people through all of that, all of the
Mhm.
tumult and all of the turmoil. And he was active in doing so. He would go out and he'd look for people's needs, and like he would go and, in the middle of the worst of the economic crisis, go out to rural, remote communities and see what they needed and bring that to them, and even as bishop, Peru, the North, was hit from the time he stepped in almost, was hit with sort of one environmental crisis after another, and then also political crises. So he's somebody that knows what it means. He knows what poverty is. He's somebody that knows what crisis is. He's dealt with and navigated very complex political situations, and has been a man of action and real social action. And he also volunteered to handle um, you know, uh, pastoral outreach to migrants when he was with the, when he was bishop, and he volunteered to be in charge of, the pastoral outreach to migrants as part of the Social Action Commission for the National Bishops Conference. So he's somebody that is very committed to where he sees an area of need. So he's somebody
Mhm.
that looks for needs, tries his best to meet them efficiently, but he's also somebody that is extremely experienced in navigating very delicate situations, and if you look at the global scenario and the state of global affairs that he's stepping into as Pope, that's it's also a very complicated and delicate situation. And he's somebody that is perfectly up to the task, I think, because at some level or another, he's been doing that his whole life, this sort of
Mhm.
balancing act. So I think that's something that stuck out to me as a general quality, about his life and about who he is, that I think is going to be very relevant, but very helpful to what he's doing now as Pope.
Yeah. It's funny you say that because you might remember, well, maybe you might know, it's Cardinal Pulic from Bosnia,
Yeah.
who was standing right next to him on the loggia, and I didn't know who he was. I just remember seeing him. I'm like, he's clearly friends with now Pope Leo, and just so happy for him, this old man. Then the more I looked into him, I think I've talked about him on the podcast before, but he was the youngest cardinal in the church at one point in the early 90s. In his 40s, I think John Paul II made him a cardinal because he was doing a lot of the same thing that you're saying, like taking care of the faithful in a brutally war-torn area. I actually found out another small wrinkle to this. My barber, who I think is culturally Muslim, was
Mhm.
born in the same town as that cardinal. So we're talking about when Pope Leo got elected. You talk about an interesting kind of threshold conversation, if you will, where he's like, "Oh, this cardinal, is he's a real one." It was I think my barber and his family had emigrated away because it was so bad in the
Wow.
early 90s. But I wonder if that's why they're friends.
That it very well could be because you have a shared experience like that, I'm Pulic lived it, and he ended up, they migrated. He had to live through that, and Prevost was one who stepped in as a missionary to help accompany them.
Hmm.
The people experienced that through that crisis, and he's somebody that gained a lot of respect, because of his action with the people. He was seen as somebody, Francis would call the bishop with the smell of the sheep, right? He was somebody that
Hmm.
was out on the streets with the people, had his sleeves rolled up, and you see pictures with him, in this flood. There was a big typhoon that hit Peru and wiped out a lot of houses and a lot of infrastructure in northern Peru. When he's just his last few months as bishop,
Oh,
he was
wow.
already preparing to come to Rome, and this again, this massive, sort of environmental crisis struck. Like this typhoon devastated a lot of the rural communities, and we saw him out there in his boots, and you know, in flood water, standing, So he would literally do it. He'd just go out and he'd say, okay, he was already packing his bag for Rome, basically, but he's like, let's go out, let's film the last video, let's see if we can get, some people to support rebuilding these houses or whatever, and that's the kind of guy he was. So I think that sort of experience, when you can share that with somebody, or when you talk to somebody, you meet somebody who understands it, and has been through something similar, that does create a bond. That does create a bond. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So I like the biographical current affairs piece. I tend to be more interested in the man because I've spent the last however many years, almost a decade, I guess, gosh, studying the men, and the politics in any age seems to be not immaterial, but it's just interesting to see how the church navigates through it. In
Mhm.
obviously in Christendom, it was much more direct, and the popes were commanding armies. Now it's not so much that. There's a certain segment of the online crowd who would like some sort of return to that. I don't I could just go for the Pope growing beards again, but where do
Anybody,
you
many
maybe right. Where yeah, where do you see Pope Leo going in relation to the last 3 pontificates? I mean, there's kind of an open-ended question. People compare it to Francis, obviously, because he was the immediate predecessor. Francis made him a cardinal. They seem to be relatively close. But we can't escape John Paul II, nor should we, or Benedict XVI. So where do you see how he fits into that puzzle, I guess?
I see it as, many people might not say this initially, but I see it as perfect continuity. Um, you can draw a straight line through what they're trying to do, and a lot of people I think look at, okay, since Second Vatican Council, popes like, John the 23rd, Paul the Sixth, as sort of these liberal progressive titans of their day, and they had a vision, they had an instinct that they thought the church needed to go in this direction, Um, and if you look at what was happening with those guys, and especially since the council, and then the council and the way that its reforms were applied specifically in Latin America, it was a very distinct application, in the way that that was lived and embraced. Um, it had a very specific impact there. And, Francis came along and Robert Prevost came along in the reverberations of that, as young men and priests, pastors, uh, so that's happening on one side, but then you have, like John Paul comes along and he's so often associated, him and Benedict are so often associated with like moral issues, being supportive of the family, sort of these conservative personalities. But one of the things people miss about John Paul II is that he was also a social pope. When he was young he was involved in the labor movement.
Right.
And people they forget that, like, he was very socially involved even as a young man, and as pope, yes, he became this titan of family values and of morality, but he also has an entire social magisterium that's, I think, been forgotten. He had 3 social encyclicals, and Centesimus Annus was a big one in its day,
Right.
and then there's the foundation Centesimus Annus that was founded afterwards to promote the church's social doctrine.
Hmm.
So he's already setting the framework for the church to have the 2 things at once. Let's talk about morality and let's make sure that we're legitimate and we're good to go on these issues, that this church's teaching is solid, but also let's have this conversation about social issues because the need to discuss that, right? More social problems are on the rise, and they were even then. Obviously, he combated countless manifestations, you know, of that himself. I mean, look what he did with
Hmm.
communism, right? And the after effect of that, there was a lot that he dealt with, and he saw the need to discuss social issues very seriously and to have a very serious conversation about that. Benedict XVI, I think, carried that forward in his own way. He was really fundamentally an academic who wanted to lead a master's course, on faith and
Right.
reason. That's what he wanted to do, at
Go
heart.
back to the German countryside and read books.
Exactly, that's what he wanted to do, and he wanted the church to do that, Um,
Right.
I think he would have been happy just doing that, but he also was the one, if you look carefully, he was the one who was really the eco pope that went green. He put in recycling in Vatican City, he put solar panels on, the big audience hall, the Paul VI audience hall, and he already started having conversations about, social issues, about the environment, so people thought that was new under Francis, it wasn't, Benedict was the first one that started talking about it, so he's hailed as this conservative hero, but if you look at what he did, I mean, it's really not that incompatible with much of what Francis did as well. And then Francis comes along and he, shifts the church in this direction, much more towards he really embraced, the preferential option for the poor.
Hmm.
Which is something that came out of these ecclesial meetings in Latin America in the wake of the Vatican Council. It was like they really embraced this preferential option for the poor and this movement of, the social movement. And Francis comes along. So you see popes laying the groundwork for this, all along, especially since the council. And Francis sort of through the church. He thrust it in that direction. And Leo, given his experience in Peru, um, all the social crisis that he had to manage and to navigate during his time there, you know, um, he's taking that up, and he's carrying that forward in many ways. He's going to do it differently. He's going to be himself. He's not Francis 2.0. A lot of people say,
Mhm.
"Is he going to be Francis 2.0?" No, he's going to carry forward much of the vision, and he's going to embrace and share a commitment with several of the issues that Francis also held dear. But he's going to do it in his own way and with his own sense of priorities. Um, so I think that there's a perfect continuity between the popes of recent history, and I think Francis came in with this. I think he was a visionary. I think he had this big vision for what he wanted the church to do, and we saw that with his synod of bishops and synodality. He had this vision. He wanted the church to get it, like, so bad. I think much of the church didn't get it still,
Mhm.
but he so badly wanted the church to get it, to understand what he was trying to do. I think he was oftentimes misunderstood, and people were confused by what he wanted to do. And some of that was his own ambiguity, which he liked to keep people guessing, but some of that I think was just his own personality. He was more abstract. He saw
Right.
something and he wanted you know, other people see that. Robert Prevost is somebody that is not a visionary himself, but he's somebody that can see and recognize a visionary. And he's somebody that can make that concrete. And I think that's where we're at
Mhm.
now. I think he is going to make concrete many of the things and much of the vision that Pope Francis had. But he's going to tweak some things along the way. He's going to do it with his own style. And obviously his style is very different than Francis,
Mhm.
So we're going to see him carry this forward, but in his own Leo way.
Mhm. Yeah, I like that answer. And I tend to agree. It's all if I would have friends ask me when Francis was in the news for allegedly saying this, that, or the other thing, and you'd go read the source material and the context in which he said it, and it wasn't that big of a deal. There was some that matters of prudential judgment or whatever it was. Like, okay, sure, reasonable minds can disagree, but generally, I've always been of a similar mind that it's a continuity. I remember a priest one time saying something along the lines of, John Paul taught us how to think about these issues because he was a philosopher. Benedict taught us what to think because he was a theologian, and Francis is kind of teaching us how to live it. Um, but I think in that latter part of your answer, where Francis did have this big vision, I think it was beautiful. What he said in Rio, what was it? I want you to go make a mess. And
Yeah,
there was the
yeah.
the analogy that I read
Wreak havoc.
someplace.
Yeah,
Right.
like
I want this analogy that I read someplace else after the fact was, if you clean out a closet, you have to make a mess in the hallway in order to put it all back in an orderly fashion, to know what to throw away, to know what to keep, and all these sorts of things.
yeah.
And I think what it seems to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, or from your perspective, is Francis seemed to have the vision, which was good, but maybe the judge of character of the people who was having implement it was maybe not the greatest. Probably just because people who have the big visions aren't generally personnel people. But it seems like Pope Leo is a personnel guy, so he'll take
Yeah.
the vision and maybe move the pieces around a little bit more
I think
efficiently.
I think it's exactly right. I think Francis was a visionary, but people who think big like that and abstract are not the best with practical things, you know?
Right.
And I think Francis was one of those people. He and he liked he picked people that he trusted very carefully, but I think oftentimes he made perhaps bad judgment calls in that, like he was not that kind of um personality. Like he was, again, he thought big and he didn't, but I think towards the end he understood. At least there were a few people that he did make good choices with, and I think he understood, especially Robert Prevost was somebody that um had unique abilities, and you
Hmm.
saw from when he brought him to Rome, and then he was in the dicastery for bishops, and then put him on like 7 different dicasteries in
Right.
addition to that, including the Vatican City State, the commission that manages the Vatican City State. So he was in like
Right.
everything. So I think Francis, in broad strokes, struggled with personnel appointments. He struggled with choosing the right advisors, and that got him into trouble oftentimes. But I think once in a while he did see somebody. special, and I think he saw something in Robert Prevost, and that was clear, and in February, like just a couple weeks before, I think, or maybe it was January, just a couple weeks before he went into the hospital, he made he elevated, you know, Robert Prevost's status. He was a cardinal deacon, and then he just made him a cardinal bishop, which
Hmm.
if you're in the insider Catholic crowd, you know what that means, right?
Right.
It's a distinction in rank. And it spoke a lot. There are only a handful, maybe now 10, maybe 9 or 10 cardinal bishops, but voting cardinals, voting cardinal bishops, there were only five, and Robert
Right.
Prevost was one of them.
Hmm.
And that happened just before Francis died. So I think Francis certainly saw something in him. And, a lot of people asked, did Francis see or Robert Prevost as potentially his successor?
That's exactly what I was just thinking just now. And it's never occurred to me, surprisingly. But we hear all these
I
stories about popes supposedly maybe naming their successor. Did Pope Francis think that?
I think he had an intuition. I think towards the end he saw that there was a real possibility. And I think maybe he saw in that designation of cardinal bishop towards the end, I think was like him, that was his mark, I think, saying, "This is the one I trust." This is the
Mm.
guy I think is right. He's the one I think that can do it, that can do what I want, that I can bring to fruition what I've been trying to do, but he's the right one to take this banner and run with it, and Leo is doing that at his own pace,
Hmm.
I think he will keep going with a lot of things Francis wanted, especially, he said on the balcony, we want to be a synodal church, and in our interview, he talked about Francis having this big, beautiful vision of synodality. So it's something that, many people thought synodality would just die after Francis passed away, and that it would sort of fizzle on the shrivel on the vine, but that hasn't been the case, and you can see that Leo very much intends to make that grow and to carry it forward, um, but in his own way. So
Hmm. I was gonna say maybe just a point of clarification there too, because I mean, I feel like I have synodality fatigue, and I never really got too deep into it. But I get the sense
you're
that,
not alone.
in,
You're
right,
not alone.
right, yeah, that's good to know. Well, and maybe this speaks to Francis's vision and not quite being able to execute how he had hoped when he was alive. Is it seemed like synodality was interpreted as everybody gets a vote and then we're going to change stuff at the end of it. And I don't think that was ever the case. Because I mean, this general synod existed in what, John Paul's time, or did
Mhm.
Paul VI create it? I forget
Yeah.
exactly, but that maybe, yeah, point of clarification, if you can kind of speak to that a little bit more, that's never really been the intention. What has been the intention to your mind instead
Well, I
of
think
that?
just to open a conversation to get what Francis wanted to do with synodality is change. It was really a synod on ecclesiology more than it was on. So when you're talking, then I don't know, what is synodality, right? People still can't define it.
Hmm.
It's a specific way of being church. It's this less hierarchical, more collaborative style of living and existing as a church. Francis so often criticized clericalism, and I think he saw synodality as sort of a continuation of even the Second Vatican Council's reforms, and it's impetus for a more empowered laity. It placed such an emphasis on the role of the laity and in the church and in society, right? It's um, sort of an empowered role for lay people in general. And I think Francis saw part of that vision was a transformation in the church. That the church has problems with power. It has problems
Hmm.
with clerical status. And this applies to a variety of issues. Whether you're talking about involvement of lay people, whether you're talking about the abuse crisis, whether you're talking about women, and their role in the church. It has to do with the concentration of power. At in the clerical class, if you will. And I think what Francis wanted to do is separate that sense of power from the priesthood, from holy orders. And he tried to
Hmm.
do that also in the Curia through his reforms, by separating saying you don't have to be a cardinal or a bishop to be a prefect of a dicastery,
Hmm.
Um, the canonical argument, a theological argument for so long is okay, but they're sharing in the authority of the Pope, you know, um, who is a man, and his holy orders. So to share in that, you necessarily have to have, you know, the same qualities. And I realize this is a very loose explanation, so it's
Hmm.
not very precise at all, but it's the generic idea of it, right? So it's a transformation in how the church sees authority. And the sharing in the authority of the Pope. Do you need to be in holy orders or a man to do that? Or is it him giving you that authority enough, no matter who you are?
Hmm.
So I think it's, transforming the very structure of the church to be, yeah, less clerical, less concentrated, power less concentrated with the clergy, but also how do we reallocate some of that to lay people? How do we let them take more of a protagonistic role at the local level in their local parishes and communities, at the local, bishops' conference, but also in the Roman Curia? And how do we make sure that lay people have a more prominent role, that women have a more prominent role? And how do we do that without changing necessarily our, the structures or teachings or doctrine? It's a
Hmm.
rethinking of that. So I think that's what Francis wanted to do. He wanted to have this conversation. And I think the synods and synodality, it wasn't designed to come up with some prefabricated solution. I think that was the solution. Is
Hmm.
holding those meetings and starting to get that dynamic into place, and Robert Prevost is somebody, if you look at his life, he's already been practicing that for his entire ministry. If you look at the way that he ran his parishes, the Augustinians ran their parishes in northern Peru really since the 70s, and before that, since they arrived, they had a very specific way that they ran their parishes, and I won't get into it all, it's too much, but you can read it in the book. They
Right.
had a very specific structure that was very collaborative between the people and the pastor, and
Hmm.
he always depended on teams of lay people, and many of those teams of lay people were led by women. So he's somebody that has been doing this, and the people that I talked to in Peru, said, "Synodality, we've been doing this for decades," you know?
Well, it
So
seems like it wasn't something that was devoid of um, proper correction if there were legitimate abuses, because you see the same, like Pope Leo when he was Bishop Prevost would hear about some kooky something in a parish, and he would walk in and kind of go with the flow, and then would make the correction afterwards. So you're not going to do this anymore. Like there's stuff that would, in his, it's not like it's completely abandoning the role of the superior priest, the bishop, whatever, but it's making it. The irony that I'm being reminded of too is like what we see in Charlotte, where it's a small, relatively small Latin mass community, but it seems like the bishop is just, who is still new, just going in and kind of single handedly dismantling all these sorts of things. I'm sure there's always more to the story, but
yeah.
it seems like it's very anti synodality, which is the supreme irony because everybody associates synodality with the libs, quote unquote, in the church, and never with the quote unquote conservatives. I hate using those terms to describe church
Yeah.
things, but
Well, I do
but
too,
it's
but
like yeah.
that's the discussion has become, as
Right,
a
yeah,
we
but like
find it.
stuff like that just seems ironic, and I think you're right that it seems like Pope Leo's going to be implementing that in the way that the vision was intended,
Yeah.
how the execution ended up being.
Well,
Because
and he
yeah.
touches on this point, in the interview, in that final conversation we have, I asked him about the authority of bishops' conferences or whatever, and bishops, how they're understanding that in light of synodality, and he does say, like, look, yeah, a lot of people are afraid of synodality, or, they're hesitant to embrace it because they think, oh, this is taking my authority. And this is the Pope I'm quoting. He said, well, maybe you're not understanding your authority right.
Ooh, oh
Like,
man.
you don't have a proper understanding what your authority is, you know? So again, so we're having this conversation about power and authority and what that means, especially in a hierarchical church. The church is sort of re-examining itself, and I think you're going to see a lot of situations like you've just described, and there's going to be difficulty in implementing this, and I think Leo's not ignorant of that fact, but he also is very practical in a way that
Hmm.
Francis, again, was not. And he's gonna find a way to get it done, and he's gonna be able to deal with, I think, hiccups along the way or resistance to it. He's prepared for that. But again, he's very practical and he's been in leadership almost his whole life, and he's sort of known for being able to solve complex problems without too much um, tension, you know? So I
Hmm.
think, um, again, if there's one person for the job, he seems to be it. So, I think there's a great sense of anticipation for what he might do and a great sense of hope as well for the direction he's going to, take things in.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm just realizing that when I said we were running short on time, that was 22 minutes ago. So it's almost like we enjoy talking about Pope Leo, both of us,
I
which
know,
is
right?
a good
Awesome.
a good problem to have.
Yes.
Well, yeah, well, we can maybe put a pin in it there. I'd love to have you on again sometime, maybe once the book's all the way out, or
Yeah.
because I love talking about all this stuff. But I really appreciate your insights, and again, thanks for making the time. So, talk a little bit about the book. Where can people find it? When's it? Forgive me. When is it officially coming out? I know it was released in Spanish, wasn't it? But is the
Yes.
English
So
edition coming out soon?
the yeah, so the original version is the Spanish version. So I wrote the book in Spanish.
Okay.
And so that came out September 18th in Peru. So it's available in all bookstores in Peru. It's available online. It's now available in Spain, Mexico, Colombia. It's making its way through Latin America. It's also available in certain locations in the Spanish version. In the United States, Miami, I think, sells it in Spanish.
Oh,
You
okay.
know, um, it just was released on the 19th of November in French. So in France, you can find it in bookstores and online across the country. As of next year, the beginning around March or so, it should be released in Portuguese and in Italian. And I'm sorry, English speakers, you have to wait until May for the
Oh
English.
man,
I know. I know.
feel like that's good for Americans to wait until last. I think
Until
that's good. We
last,
usually,
well,
yeah, we're usually
they're
spoiled.
followed actually by Slovenian, Croatian, Czech, and Slovakian.
Oh wow,
Where he's going to come out in all those languages too. So,
yeah,
English will be last, but it will be late. But it's going to be hopefully for the first anniversary of the papacy, which should make it special. So I hope that that's yeah, I hope that's the case. Hoping we get it out for the 8th of May. That would be
yeah,
my
that
goal.
would be
But
great.
so expect it in May. Keep a lookout, and I'll try to sound the alarm. Make some noise
Yeah,
when
no,
I
perfect.
know when I
Well,
have a real date.
hmm, well, yeah, I'll set an appointment. I'll set a reminder for myself too. Maybe around March or April, we can do round two, and chat about it more. Because I mean, it'll be, yeah, 6 more months of Leo. I didn't think it was possible, by the way, to like Leo anymore until you just said what you said about, well, maybe you don't understand your authority well enough about bishops. I mean, I love that.
He's a
I'm
little
faithful
capricious.
to,
There's a lot
yeah,
underneath the surface with him. So,
yeah, yeah. It just, yeah, makes the mystery all the more. But anyways, well, great. Anything else that you'd like to promote? Where can people find you? In the meantime, obviously the book.
uh,
Yeah, you preface, but where
yeah,
can people find your work?
well, thank you, Matt. You can find it on the Crux site, cruxnow.com. And I have social media accounts. I don't use them as much as I should, but I use Instagram, so you can follow me on Instagram, Elise Ann Allen. Uh,
Okay.
I'd be grateful.
All right. Perfect. Yeah. Well, thanks again for joining the show. We'll, yeah, look forward to the book. If you speak any of those languages, listeners to the podcast, you can get it now. Well, if you speak Spanish, I guess you can get it now. But
And
yeah,
French.
us English speakers will wait for a little, and French. That's right. Yeah, us English speakers can wait patiently. But yeah, I can't wait to read it. What I've seen so far is great, and this conversation was amazing. Um, so thanks again.
Thank you, Matt. It was a pleasure.
Well, there you have it. What a great, again, what a great interview. So great talking to Elise. I want to thank her again for appearing on the show. I am super excited to read it. Unfortunately, I'm not a fluent Spanish or a French speaker, so I will have to wait, along with, I'm sure, many of you, to read the book in May. But mark that on your calendar. Again, I'll make sure to give that a shout out once the date gets closer. One other thing that I wanted to just kind of close this podcast with, kind of a random piece of something. I have a great friend, Bianca, who currently lives in Paris. We used to work together a few years ago. Um, and she knows of my great love for papal history. So in the mail the other day, much to my surprise, I see a package from France, which is incredible. And inside it was this little, it looked like a wallet. For those of you who are listening to the audio podcast, tune in over on YouTube to see what this is if you're curious. But it's just a little, I don't know, 3 inch by 3 inch square wallet. Well, I open it up, and actually, first, before I spoil what's inside, um, it's just incredible craftsmanship. Was the first thing I noticed about it. It's all leather, and it's bound. It's clearly very old, but it's bound in, I assume, is it really thin leather, some sort of thread around the outside, but it's handmade. There's little roses embossed all the way around with a little floral pattern. And I open it up, and it's a medallion. This is especially fitting because we're in 2025. It's this little medallion of Pope Pius XI, and you notice around the outside it says Anno Santo Roma 1925, which is the holy year, which is also Jubilee year. So anybody who's been paying any sort of attention to goings on in the Catholic Church, goings on in Rome. Obviously, we got a new pope. Obviously, Pope Francis died earlier this year, but it was in the middle of the Jubilee, and the Jubilee only happens, I think, every 50 years, every 25, 50 years. There's extraordinary ones, but 2000 was the last one, overseen by John Paul II. But 2025, so this is exactly 100 years old, and it was clearly something that was, I guess, issue. I have no idea. If anybody out there knows anything about this, this historical medallion from Pius XI, I am all ears. I would love to see this. It did not just break, by the way. I know it just flopped forward, but it did not. It did not break. I promise. But it's just incredible. The detail on this again is so rich that I wanted to share because obviously, if you listen to the Popecast, you have at least some nerdy interest in papal history, as do I, obviously, as the host. So I just wanted to share this. But the detail on this is incredible. It also has the 4 papal basilicas around the outside. So that'd be St. Mary Major, St. Peter's, St. John Lateran, and St. Paul outside the walls, which, again, St. Paul outside the walls famously has all of the medallions of all of the popes and even a few anti-popes. Fun fact, around the perimeter of the inside of the basilica. But just an incredible piece, a little bit of papal history that, again, thank you, Bianca. What a great friend. What a very thoughtful thing. She said she saw it and knew that that I had to have it because it was so special. So it's something I will cherish for a very long time. If you're an artist out there, please make stuff like this because we just don't see craftsmanship like this nearly as often as we should anymore. So so a beautiful gift, an incredible little papal history nugget that I did not expect to get. And so I hope you're as edified by the story that something like that is still out there. And anyways, so that does it for this episode of our podcast. We will have a new background the next time I record an episode because my family and I are moving. But this is the last time you'll see a blank white background. So there will be a new studio incoming later this week. So stay tuned for that. And remember, as always, that although these are strange times we live in, they are no stranger than in ages past. Until next time.